And well, I'd like to begin by also thanking New Direction on behalf of the entire panel because for this terrific conference. I think we are very much enjoying it, though I know what's wrong with the audience this morning. No, we are discussing very interesting topics. We are having very necessary discussions. And the topic of immigration and integration in this case, or freedom of movement, is one of those. It's a bit broad, as were many of the topics we've discussed so far. So I guess we can have a 5-minute long or so opening remarks from our panelists, and then I will ask more specific questions to try to narrow it down a bit. So we can start with you maybe, Alan? Okay. Yes, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yes. Okay. I would also start by thanking New Direction for giving me the honor to speak before the audience of so many brilliant minds. I must admit that it is a little bit scary. When I was asked to give an introduction to my line of thought regarding freedom, migration, and conservatism, I chose to get close to the subject by asking myself a question and then trying to answer it. I'm not sure if neither the question or the answers is interesting in any way or relevant for this panel, but it's the only thing I have prepared, so I guess I'm going to have to force you to listen to it. I also hope that you will forgive me. Both my English and my memory is pretty bad, so I'm going to have to look down on my notes quite a bit. But the question I asked myself was, why is it that conservatives that tend to cherish freedom more than most also tend to be the ones who want to restrict freedom of movement in the shape of mass migration more than most? On the surface of things, this can seem as a paradox or a double standard. Like in so many cases before, I found that the late Sir Roger Scruton was the one who had given the best explanation to this. Scruton said, quote, "Conservatism is about freedom, yes, but it's also about institutions and attitudes that shape the responsible citizen and ensure that freedom is a benefit to us all. Conservatism is therefore also about the limits to freedom." End of quote. I personally find this very wise and deeply true, but how can it be applied on the topic of freedom and migration? To answer that question, I think we need to go back to the basic conservative view of the human nature and character. Conservatives tend to view the individual as unperfect and with an inheritable potential for both good and evil. If individuals and societies shall have optimal chances of coming close to their full potential for good, they need support systems in the shape of family, beauty, virtues, security, traditions, customs, and community. Fairly decent societies are a rare thing in human history. Those societies are a fragile and complex weave of thin threads that has been built up through the centuries. This weave that is unique for every society helps the citizens to be good to each other. It makes sense to them and it helps them make sense of the world. To tear up or very rapidly change this weave is one of the most potentially dangerous and destructive things a political leader can do. Recent developments in my own country of Sweden is a good example of this. To once again clarify by using the words of Sir Roger Scruton, every society depends on an experience of membership, a sense of who we are, why we belong together, and what we share. This experience is pre-political. It precedes all political institutions and provides our reason for accepting them. It unites left and right, blue collar and white collar, man and woman, parent and child. To threaten this first-person plural is to open the way to atomization, as people cease to recognize any general duty to their neighbors and set out to pillage the accumulated resources while they can. So, to conclude, it's not so weird as it might seem at the surface that many conservatives simultaneously cherish freedom and also want to restrict freedom of movement in the shape of migration. The reason for this is that we also cherish community, culture, identity, and security. My suggestion for a general conservative attitude towards migration is that it should be viewed as a positive thing, as long as it is beneficial to all, but that it should also be limited as soon as it is threatening the first person plural. And with that, also the sense of home, belonging, security within a society. At what limit that threat occurs must be up to every nation to decide for itself. It should definitely not be decided by the European Union or any other transnational organization. In a society that is managing these policies badly and become ridden by conflict, like my own country, and with violence, and that lacks community and internal solidarity, and are also dominated by a foreign entity, I believe that no citizen can be truly free. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks first to New Direction for bringing us back together again. It's nice to see real people, isn't it, rather than over the screen. And it's great to see a lot of friends, former MEP colleagues from many nations, including Mattias here. So it's very special to me because I haven't been able to go back to Brussels since I left as an MEP 2 years ago. So thank you, New Direction, for this excellent conference. I would say think tanks, I think, are very, very important. I was chairman of the Bow Group years ago with 100 MPs, 7 members of cabinet, of the UK cabinet, and papers came out like on privatizing industry, which was not well regarded at the time, but then became Thatcher's sort of prime policy. So, you know, it can happen with think tanks. But they do need to think. Not all think tanks think. I know it sounds like a sort of ridiculous thing to say, but that is often the case. So I just wanted to say, lastly, but Portugal, of course, has the longest international treaty in the world, which is with England, not Scotland, but with England, from 1386. So there's rather good heritage here in terms of international treaties. On the subject, freedom of movement, immigration and integration, I wanted to make 3 quick points, if I may. I think the first thing is the whole scale now of migration, immigration, whatever we're going to call it, is so huge. I think we have to redefine what it means to be a refugee. You know, are refugees the same as asylum seekers? Are they the same as economic migrants? I don't think they are. And this whole business of definition is a real problem area. And clearly economic migration is on a massive scale now, and it's affecting all of our nations. It's an international problem. It's quite clear that army interpreters escaping Afghanistan are political refugees. Their lives are at risk. But many people are turning up, you know, in designer clothes with their mobile phones, paying traffickers. And there's a huge movement of people, and in this world of internet, everyone knows what's going on. I visited a camp in Iraq, and they are fully aware of what's happening all around the world, you know, how to get places. They want help to get to Britain or to Europe or whatever. You know, we're living in this global world now, and I think we must redefine what refugee status is from that 1951 convention. And on that note, the second point is I think we are in a kind of knot, I call it, of laws, conventions, treaties, rules, which the ordinary person in the street, the citizen, is wondering what on earth is going on, because, you know, borders are being overridden. People are sort of coming over in mass numbers, and there doesn't seem to be any way of stopping them. I mean, I give you an example. In Britain, we had just the other day 459 refugees on boats coming from France. We've had 16,300 this year. I mean, that's a large town that's arrived. We don't know who they are, a lot of these people. They may have destroyed their papers. One boat was full of weapons, by the way, quite sophisticated modern weapons. I was told by the Peshmerga, because I was chairman of the Iraq delegation of the European Parliament, you know, watch out because, there are terrorists embedded in refugees. And of course, the Royal Navy picked up the Manchester bomber off Libya. We actually rescued this guy who went on to kill 19 of our people. It's a great way of thanking us, isn't it? So I'm very worried about this because, I mean, for example, we're now failing to be able to actually deport people that have no legal claim to be in our country. We had a plane the other day, I think the capacity is about 300. One passenger was left on board because we have all these human rights lawyers that they file these last-minute claims and they pull people off the plane. You get left with a handful. And the whole thing is ridiculous, and we've got to address all these international treaties, etc. I think the third point is, and this is very relevant, I think, to right-of-centre institutions like New Direction and all of our parties and groups, is that there is an institutional resistance to, even when we're in government, we're not in power sometimes, and that is a very worrying point. I mean, the Home Office in Britain, which deals with a lot of these issues, is 28,000 people. And our Home Secretary, the person responsible, I think has done a very noble job sort of fighting to sort this. But, she's got a lot of civil servants that are trying to undermine her and bring her down and stop what she's trying to do. And we collectively cannot accept this. And that is a really major problem. And that is true, I think, right across the world. So those are my sort of three main areas I think are worth focusing on. And I would just say that we all represent different think tanks or aspects. I mean, if we could sort of combine and take different aspects of all those areas, this knot of laws and conventions, take different aspects and actually do papers or analysis, research, collectively, I think we could have quite an impact. So, thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
Okay. Well, thank you again to New Direction for hosting this, and to my fellow panelists. This is actually a fascinating topic, but I've got to tell you all, this is the doom and gloom panel. Because there's no good news on this subject. There really isn't. As you just heard from Mattias and David, there is no good news, and it's going to get worse. And I think we have to appreciate the scale of the problem that we have created for ourselves in this regard. And what do I mean by that? Mattias sketched out the sort of the essential conundrum at the start. Conservatives should be in fact, everyone should be in favour of migration from a freedom of movement perspective and from an economic perspective, because of course, if there are no people to do X number of jobs, you need to bring people in to do them. We all understand that. That's the best way for an economy to function. The problem, of course, is in our societies today, our population pyramid is such that we have essentially, for want of a less technical term, screwed ourselves from the point of view that we do not have the people coming through to do the jobs needed in that scale. We also have come up with an entitlement culture that says, I don't do those sorts of jobs. And you can see it unfolding right now, actually, in the UK. There's currently a crisis today of petrol not being delivered to a petrol station forecourts this morning. And it's going to lead to panic buying and everything else. The reason being not that we don't have enough petrol, but we have no lorry drivers. Why do we have no lorry drivers? Because we're not bringing in migrants to do it, and nobody in Britain wants to do it. There's a frantic debate in the cabinet about this, the British cabinet. One side says, let's put them on the list of skill shortages so we can import people. The others say, no, we'll increase the pay to encourage British people to drive lorries instead. But that's not an effective way to run an economy if you think about it. However, the flip side is, you bring more people in, then you fall into the integration issue, the problem of, is this going to be sensible from a national point of view? And we've seen time and time again, in country across country, that we cannot cope at the present with various migrant populations, people who have not been integrated. We've done a terrible job, frankly, of integration. There may be a couple of good examples across Europe and other places, but it's not essentially something we've done well. And overarching all of this is the trend that we're seeing, that David was referring to, of increased migration coming our way. This century is going to be, whatever we thought of last century, this century is going to be the one where more people than ever from different parts of the world try to get to other parts of the world for what they see as a better life. And the reality is that people are mobile, they understand the routes to get in, they know how they can reach the UK, Europe, other places. And as a result, we're going to see, over the course of the next 80 years, a mass displacement of population. So the question, therefore, is what do we do about it? Now, the thing that we've learned not to do is what we did in the last refugee crisis, in the Syrian crisis. I mean, it's extraordinary, actually, to think back as to what actually happened. We had the de facto leader of Europe, Angela Merkel, saying, come all of you, we will settle 1 million of you more, in fact. Just come, we'll take you in. Other countries quite happy, some were sceptical, but the European Union really opened its borders. Now, as I said, some were sceptical, said we're not going to do this, but the results were, of course, that you saw vast displacement of people coming in again to the European continent. It's caused issues in the countries who took them. And if you look today to the reaction to the Afghanistan crisis, for example, even Mrs. Merkel is not saying come. That she's not. Why? Because they saw the difficulty of integrating last time round. Now, we could have predicted this. If you take 1 million people in that short space of time, you are not going to be able to integrate them. And you had the extraordinary spectacle of the Chancellor of Germany having to write letters to immigrants saying, in Germany, don't be anti-Semitic. This is not what we do here. I mean, the irony of this is extraordinary, that Germany had imported a whole cast of these people who did share the values of the time. The second thing that we did back in 2015-16 that, in retrospect, we probably shouldn't have done is bribe Mr. Erdogan, give him lots of money to keep a loaded gun at our heads with all the migrants in that sense as well. The deal, as you know, has just been reworked over. We've had another sort of extension of this deal. He's sitting pretty. Anytime he wishes to sort of, unload his migrants, he can just threaten again, and we go, we'll give you more money. So we've created a situation where we are, of course, now paying Turkey to be our repository there. And others have understandably learned this. It was referenced at the start. Mr. Lukashenko at Belarus has decided he wants to get in the game of sort of being bribed as well. And of course, what he's done is encouraged Afghans to come. He's flown them in, and Iraqis, and then he's purposely shipped them to borders. Now, the only good news in this, and then said, of course, that if you don't lift sanctions, I'm going to keep on creating problems for your borders. The only positive thing from this is, again, the Europeans have learnt from what happened 5-6 years ago. They've realised you have to reinforce the external borders. Your first job is to do that. You can deal with the integration issue afterwards. And I think it's been interesting to see, the only perhaps bit of good news here is how the Baltic states have been, how their borders have been reinforced, money's been sent there, the Poles have been resolute, and we're not seemingly playing that game with him in the same way we've done with Erdogan. But, to leave you with this thought, as I said, this is going to be one of the big questions of the coming century, basically. It's good we're discussing this now. The real question we have to look at is, what is our effective external policy to keep migrants from arriving in the first place? If we don't want them, of course. If we do want them, that's a different story. That's a matter for us all to discuss. But those who are arriving illegally, we clearly don't. So there's that sort of question there. And the second issue is, the one tied to that is, how do we finally bring in, if it's possible, an effective integration policy? And I think at the moment, we are very far away from a solution on both those, and perhaps the collective wisdom in this room can help bring us forward to a better solution. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you all for the opening remarks. I will start with a definition question that you, David, addressed. So, because definitions or terms matter, and they should matter, right? But at the same time, so it would be nice for all of us to distinguish between them, but to kind of enforce them or take them into account, because sometimes it seems to me that this debate on immigration or freedom of movement, both sides of the aisle, they speak different languages. So we speak about reason, and we speak also about virtue, because, well, prudence in this case would be a virtue, right? Prudence as to what will happen regarding integration, etc. But then the other side would speak the language of sentiments or emotions, sometimes disguised as virtue as well, but some of the times being a virtue in and of itself, like, I don't know, compassion, for instance. So how do we bridge that gap in terms of conveying our message and trying to persuade or convince those that are our, ideological opponents or competitors?
Sure, do you want me?
Yes, please.
I mean, the debate over immigration is very emotive, and that's crazy, really, because it's like in the Brexit debate we had in the UK. it's not about hating foreigners or not wanting people to come in, because we're very open as a society, quite rightly, and as an economy. But it's about managing numbers, because, you know, the numbers in Britain, I mean, it was equivalent to a Birmingham, which is the second biggest city in England, arriving every year you know, without this control. And you touched on lorry drivers, etc. I mean, it's you know, what's happening at the moment. There are some painful readjustments, certainly, but it is actually about paying people more. There's a thing on the Day programme, BBC this morning, that some lorry drivers are being offered £73,000, which is a lot of money. It's almost as much as an MEP, for heaven's sake, to drive a milk lorry now. So, you know, there is an adjustment. The market's adjusting for this, and wages are rising quite markedly in the UK. And I think that's a positive thing, because actually mass immigration has driven wages down in a sort of economic sense, and that has caused quite a lot of the issues, you know, particularly around the north of Britain, to do with Brexit. They thought they're being undermined, that their wages would be driven down. So that became quite a major factor in the decision on Brexit, and that's being addressed now. Yeah.
If I may, and we can jump to the second question right now, is because you just talked about numbers. So it's all about numbers. So that leads me to the quantitative aspect of immigration. So how much immigration, or how many immigrants, and how fast, which is the other hugely important topic. So any light we can shed on this topic?
Well, I'd actually like to hear the Swedish example, because it's very interesting, of course, what's happened in Sweden over the past 20, 30 years. And that's a great example of numbers and how that works. The reality is, you don't necessarily have to have a cap on numbers or anything of this kind, as long as you can integrate the people coming in to be a part of the society and focus to be sort of the same as everyone else there. And again, that doesn't mean, by the way, that you have to, all be uniform. People can have different religions, people can, follow distant customs, but they have to acknowledge, essentially, that they're living in a Western liberal democracy, and Western liberal values are going to be the core of the state. What you're seeing, of course, increasingly in numerous European countries is a growing core of people who reject this and say, actually, no, we want to live in a different society, normally a Sharia society, for want of, in this sort of way. The police aren't welcome here. We will police it in the way that we operate, and we'd actually quite like to expand our space a little further. And, you see this, from the UK perspective, you go to certain cities now, and you end up with a monoculture in those cities, and it isn't the British monoculture, it's a different monoculture. You go to France, you'll see the banlieues, there's different monoculture there. Now, this is a recipe for disaster for our societies, which have been able to, in the past, integrate people because it was done in a much smaller way, and people were brought in, different faiths, different nationalities, came in, worked, and were part of the national cohesive whole. When you have too fast a migration, and you don't have the institutions in place to manage that, that's where your problems start, really. But like I said, I'm really interested in the Swedish example, because they've had numerous problems there.
Yeah, my country has been completely transformed in a very short period of time. And to the question of numbers, I don't think that there is a number that we can all agree on.
And also speed, right? So
yeah,
speed.
And also speed, because I think, first of all, you have to look at the impact of the community, as I said in my opening address. But the most important thing for me is that it's up to every nation state to decide, because this is I can't think of any other political issue that impacts so many other issues. It impacts social welfare, infrastructure, law and order, unique culture, identity, whatever. And the only ones who can actually, draw the line or find the balance is the people actually living in those communities who are affected by it. And I gave an example of why it's a bad thing for example, centralized migration policies to the European Union in a speech a couple of years ago. And I think that accountability is very, very important, especially when it comes to serious matters that actually really deeply impact the society and the people who live in it. And as you described, during the migrant crisis in 2015, Angela Merkel decided to open the borders with the help of the European Commission and many other people in power. And the people who took the hit from that was ordinary people in Sweden to a large extent. And one of the migrants who came in illegally in 2015, he decided to perform a terror attack in the capital of Stockholm, killing a lot of people, including an 11-year-old girl who was going to buy ice cream. And I have sat down with the father of this murdered child and talked to him and tried to comfort him and tried to also to help him to get some kind of excuse or to demand justice in some ways for this. But the fact of the matter, I am there as a national representative talking to him, doing this. The people who actually caused the problems in the first place, Angela Merkel, Guy Verhofstadt, or other people in the European Commission or whatever, they are not sitting down with this father of a murdered 11-year-old girl, and they can't be held accountable, because if he wants to, he cannot vote them away. Therefore, I think it's empirical that migration policies are decided by the people who are impacted by the immigration.
Well, thank you. Actually, in your opening remarks, quoting Scruton, you mentioned the importance of that ethos that kind of embraces immigration. You just mentioned the importance of the acknowledgement that these immigrants have to make of the culture they get in. And that leads me to the qualitative aspect of immigration, not in terms of skills, but in terms of culture, religion, so way of life, of conception of values, etc. So should we discriminate in favor of those who are like-minded people? That's, for instance, a debate in my country, in Spain. So some would say we'd rather have 30,000 legal immigrants coming from Latin America for obvious purposes, language-wise, religion, etc., than the 30,000 illegal immigrants that have entered Spain in 2021 alone through the Mediterranean. So what do you make of this qualitative aspect of immigration and of the other side of the coin? Because you just mentioned the importance of community as the ones kind of drawing the line. Sometimes we don't need external threats. The problem is that we don't do our own homework, meaning it's not clear at all our own definition of our own culture, because that's being, dissolving over the past few decades. So what is it, how on earth are we going to look for some sort of immigrants, right? If we are to look for some specific types of immigrants, if we don't know what are we looking for, because we don't know who we are anymore.
Just to comment on that. Actually, there's this whole debate in the UK about multiculturalism as a good force for good. I don't think it is. I think we need a uniculture, one culture that's broad enough for everyone, whatever background, if you're Muslim, whatever, you've got to be part of that one culture that's flexible enough and works for everyone. I have a real problem with Sharia courts. We've got about 70, I think, in the UK that are operational, and their judgments are recognised, sort of semi-recognised. I think you need one system of law. It's not really about religion, it's just one system of law, the English law or the Scots law in Scotland. And the moment you start trying to bend over and trying to be too accommodating, then you don't get the integration you're sort of talking about. And that then becomes a problem. And you get, the worst aspect of that is ghettoization, where, you basically get little countries, within your country. And there's a real danger of that, especially with the level of, we've seen, the British population, for 15 years it was stable, about 56 million. And then about 2004, when, we opened up, it's now 67 million, you know, and that's from, you know, 2004. It's a massive change, and it's just pressure on resources, numbers, you know, having to build everywhere, you know. We're one of the most crowded countries in Europe, well, it's equivalent to Malta and Holland now. So all these are major factors, I think, in controlling immigration and in achieving integration.
Thank you. Alan?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, that David's mentioned that, and it's absolutely correct. I think the reality is there was one very interesting part of our EU membership, and that was, of course, the preferential treatment given to EU migrants. In reality, from the perspective of integration, an EU migrant was going to be far more likely to integrate into the life of a fellow Western liberal democracy. I mean, there were a few problems, if you recall, with Romanians, you know, killing swans at one point, but which is a minor issue. But the swan is actually, for those who don't know, the Queen's sort of bird, and you're not allowed to kill a swan in the UK. Without permission. It's a very serious issue. But you could see, obviously, coming from a similar political tradition in most cases, and a traditional, you know, values area, made it much easier to integrate into society. And that you've kind of seen, you know, 20, 30 years down the line, you can see how that integration is working. And of course, that doesn't mean that people abandon their customs. So you'll still see Polish shops in the UK, you'll see different cultural associations in that way, but it was a much easier process to just be part of the general body politic. Now, again, that's not to say that people from other places cannot integrate. We've had many good examples, of course, of people who are first-generation immigrants, second-generation immigrants, who have clearly immigrated, clearly assimilated and been part of the British nation, and others as well. But it does make it more difficult if you're not able to handle it. It goes to your previous question about how fast and how much. You know, in small doses, not at the level of new cities emerging every, you know, 2 or 3 years, you're able to do this. But if you do have that vast increase in population and you don't have the setup in order to manage it, you will end up with integration problems. And we all recognize that there is a role for migration. We all understand that. There's, you know, a necessity in our economies to do that. But at the same time, we have to recognize the flip side of that is that we do play Russian roulette with you know, national identity. But you raised at the end the question, of course, do we know who we are? And
because societies have changed.
Of course they have. But they've changed interestingly.
So what is it to be a Brit, right?
Correct. And that is a debate, of course, as you're all seeing that now with the statue, people pulling down statues and everything else. There is this debate going on about what it is to be a Brit. Are we rewriting our history? Are we rewriting our, you know, our sort of future policy? These are questions that I think our societies are now struggling with to work it out. I think personally that most people understand what British values are in our context. I'm sure most people in European countries understand the values of their countries as well, but they're often scared of stating them because it's deemed to be racist to sort of be proud of your country in that way. I think, you know, it's a big mistake. I'm pleased that in our case, the government has, you know, been quite firm on its line. And there are all sorts of commissions being set up to look at history, to look at culture going forwards, to understand that there is a clear identity that we wish to preserve, promote and protect. And that is, of course, I think we all have to do. If we don't do that, then you're right, we then run the risk of just getting lost in this sort of, you know, kind of sea of multiculturalism.
If I may give a comment as well, I believe that if I stick to my guns, that the impact of the community and the first person plural is the most important thing when to decide how to adjust with your migration laws. I think you should differentiate if you feel that that is the best thing for your society and the social cohesion of your society. And it's not such a strange thing. For 50 years we had free movement within the Nordic countries, for example. So we discriminated against the Germans, for example, in regards to the Danes. And not saying that I think that the Germans would have been a big integrational problem, but it doesn't have to be racist or anything. It's just natural that you're closer to your neighbors, and the people from the neighboring countries have an easier path to integration. But I think it's also important to stress that I don't think that we should discriminate when it comes to helping refugees. And I believe that the best way to help refugees is to help them in the close proximity of the conflict area. That's where our money can do the most good. And I think that's also one of the answers to how do we counter the arguments from our opponents who say that it's unvirtuous, it's evil to want to restrict migration. Sweden is a good example. Like for decades, we heard from the left that we don't have to choose. We can both help refugees where they are, and we can have completely open borders. And then in 2017, when Sweden were pouring money over the refugees, we were putting people in castles because they were out of housings, and so we spent more money on 200,000 people in Sweden than the UN spent on the rest of the 65 million refugees in the rest of the world. And to finance that, we had to withdraw 40% of our foreign aid budget. So we actually allowed children to starve and to freeze to death, while putting young, healthy men, who in most cases were not really actually refugees, in castles. So and that is not virtuous, that is not good, and that is not reasonable. So yeah, that's my perspective on this matter.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Very good. After you, David.
Are you sure? Yes, I think that's a very important point, actually, is you can help refugees, true refugees, far better often and more effectively in their own regions. I mean, as I say, I was chairman of the Iraq delegation. There are 3.5 million Iraqis displaced, internally displaced persons, IDPs, within Iraq. You know, there's 3 or 4 million in Jordan. They do an amazing job, and then Turkey as well. So, you know, to be honest, this argument over 20,000, 30,000 coming to Britain or to high-cost countries, which we are in Europe, and we're crowded as well, I don't think it's very helpful. The money can go a lot further, and you can provide good accommodation elsewhere. I mean, I think Saudi Arabia has huge tracts. It's got some areas that could actually be used. The Gulf, I don't think, actually does perhaps enough in terms of looking after these refugees, you know. But I think it's a really core debate, this.
I just want to throw in that a mistake a lot of Conservatives these days make is to say they can turn inwards and not worry about what's happening in the world. And it's not our problem. We shouldn't get engaged. If we get engaged, it's going to be our issue and we'll have to deal with it. The problem with that is that it's 2021. There are no far-off countries of which we know little anymore. Or indeed, if we know little about them, they certainly don't know little about us. They know quite a lot about us, and they'd like to come to us, whatever happens in their countries. And so, as a result, this idea that you can no longer intervene, you shouldn't intervene, is a mistake. A little bit of intervention abroad to solve some of these issues on the doorsteps of those countries, preferably, by the way, even before the problems start, i.e. solving it in the country itself before you go externally, will solve a lot of problems down the line for our societies, because ultimately, if we do nothing, it will end up on our doorsteps. There will be no escape from that.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can have some questions. Yes. Are there any microphones? Okay.
Atlantic Council. I just thought I think one of the issues with the immigration debate is that we have to be kind of serious. I think in the UK, for example, the Conservative Party is very lucky because the Labour Party is so incompetent. Because if they had any competence, they would basically bust a lot of the position by taking a kind of Blairite approach of saying, tough on immigration, tough on the causes of immigration. Priti Patel, well, okay, we have a situation in the UK where we've got all these boats, the media covers it, these people coming in, but the truth is we've got 4 patrol boats. We've got 7,500 miles of coastline. I suspect anybody who's reasonably organised can bring anybody in they want. And the entire government's focus on the small number of boats going across the channel and so forth is just is entirely a PR operation where our actual physical borders remain entirely open. And one of the problems with this is that we're not actually dealing with the issue with the seriousness that it requires. I mean, if we were serious, we would have 100 patrol boats. We would have effectively a digital surveillance of the entire coastline, so we knew who was coming in and who was coming out. There's issues about private airfields as well. We don't do any of that. We're quite happy with what's going on across the channel because we get great coverage in the Daily Mail. I think that's one part of this, is that there is a complete unseriousness about immigration, which ultimately will backfire on the Conservative Party in the UK, and I think in other parties who take a similar sort of false dealing with immigration position. And the other issue is actually then tough on the causes and actually trying to deal with that. I remember having a fantastic conversation with Shankar Singham about this a few years ago, about how we actually really deal with immigration. And one of the ironies of the situation is that actually using the EU single market as a lever, we could create a whole series of single market cities around the periphery of the Union to act as magnets for investment, to keep people within the Maghreb and in other regions from which they come. And we can actually keep migrants away from the Union in a very effective and humane way. And the other thing which I think is just worth mentioning is in all of this, we've got the Russians and Lukashenko using migration as a means to destabilize the Union. And we have to recognize that that is an issue. And how do we deal with that? I mean, one of the issues the Europeans don't want to, and I think the British really don't want to put military forces on the ground, but as a migrant response, do we need perhaps our own mercenary armies to go in and hold down those areas, keep them secure, and stopping the migrant flows into the Union? I mean, if we're serious, then we've got to move away from the PR approach to migration and deal with both the actual direct threat to our borders and the causes. And at some point, it may not be Keir Starmer, but there will be a Labour leader who will actually take a more Blairite approach, and I think will make it very, very difficult for the Conservative Party. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's a fascinating issue, as well as really terrifying, this weaponized migration, right? Which leads us to the topic of security and defense. But that has always been the case, and it will always be, again, disguised by needs and compassion, I guess. Any comments on this issue?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I was going to say on the boats. This is what I mean about this knot of rules and regulations and things. Because my understanding is these boats, once they're in the water, then there is international maritime laws state that you have to, if they come to grief, you have to rescue them, and quite rightly, those on peril on the sea, the famous hymn, that's absolutely right. But what you've got with France is France can't control the coastline, all of it anyway. So various boats do get away. And once they're in the water, then the French have a sort of duty to make sure they don't come to grief. And then they get handed over to our very few patrol boats, yes, who then become a taxi service, taking them, bringing them to UK. And as I say, we don't know who these people are. They destroy a lot of their documents. I mean, but there is, as you say, the wider issue about immigration. My worry is people could start taking the law into their own hands, because there is a perception that, there's no way of stopping this. They're just talking about taking over this massive hotel. It's not a castle like in Sweden, but the stuff. But in Blackpool, where Conservative Party conference used to, the Metropole, where we used to sort of gather, Mrs. Thatcher and the Conservative Party. But this will all be asylum seekers, or whatever you call them. But there's a massive problem here, but I think we need to sort out the legal side and say, look, there's got to be some way. I mean, there's now talking about bumping boats back, which is what the Australians did. If you push them back into French waters, it's the French problem. But you can see that's going to end in grief in some shape or form, and you don't want anyone dying or whatever. So it's a hell of a problem. But really, my view is, when they hit the ground in the UK, we've got to take them somewhere else. And I know there was a Danish representative, they're talking about Africa, but he says it's probably not going to happen anyway. You know what I mean? But in my view, send them to the Hebrides, because that will sort them out. It's pretty windy up there. But I mean, just an offshore island where you can sort out, whether they're valid or not. And as I say, something like 90% are not true refugees. Some of them, what really annoys me is some of these people have been refused asylum in France and Germany before getting on these boats. And it's like, there has to be a system that says, you know, that you do not have a valid reason to be here. And I'm sorry, you know, all of us in Europe, you know, we were pretty poor 100 years ago, 150 years ago. We've had to build our own economies. So stay in your own country, we'll help you, and aid does come into that, you know, to build up your economy. I mean, I was born in India, and when I went back in the 80s, there was a shanty town on the beach in Mumbai, Bombay, and now it's gone, you know, because 250 million jobs have been created in India by globalization over 20 years. It's an amazing story. The shanty town has disappeared, and you get all this high-rise and things. You know, you can develop over time, and South Korea was like 30 years. It went from pretty poor to actually quite an advanced economy. So we've got to do that for these countries. You know, that's the long-term solution. But we've got to be tighter. We've got to be much tougher on people actually just, you know, basically jumping the queue and coming in by boat.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, I mean, the UK situation, Dave has discussed that. I'm not sure there's a role for mercenary armies as such. That would be a little concerning to have sort of mercenaries roving around Europe trying to solve matters. But I think clearly technology can offer solutions for how we can improve border security. You know, the countries themselves can direct, or European funds can be directed towards helping in that way. It is quite clear the front line needs to be reinforced. But actually, the interesting part is that the biggest sort of entry point remains the Mediterranean, again, because of this ship issue that, you know, in different forms is occurring there. And your suggestion about, you know, kind of building a periphery of cities, if you like, or focusing economic development to the nearest borders, I think is a good one, because it ties in again with what David was saying about the need to be forward-thinking in developing our neighbours and beyond in that, but also going further afield and making it less enticing. You know, the reality is that you know, the worse the rest of the world is compared to the West, the more people will come here. But the better it is, then the less people come will instead focus on building their own societies, which is what we want them to do.
Absolutely, that would be the conservative take on things. I think we only have time for one final question. So,
can I just add a short comment on what's said about weaponizing migration? I think that underlines why it's very, very bad idea for us to rely on others to control our own borders, like you mentioned with Erdogan, for example. If we know that foreign superpowers are weaponizing migration against us, and then we rely on others, very unsafe allies, to control our borders, sooner or later we are setting ourselves up for disaster, I think.
Yeah, very good point.
Absolutely. Maybe
Over here.
I'm afraid you will have to choose.
Thanks.
Okay.
Hi, Matthew Robinson from the Eurogulf Information Centre. Post-Brexit, the conversation seemed to shift away from freedom of movement. Freedom of movement became quite a controversial phrase with migration in the UK. My question is pretty simple. We already have forms of freedom of movement. We have it with Ireland. Is there scope in the future, potentially with the UK, Australia, free trade deal, with other freedom of movement blocks, potentially with Australians, where integration is not really the same type of problem posed with other migration flows? Could we have other freedom of movement blocks for the UK? But this could apply for any part of the world where it doesn't pose the same type of challenges with regards to integration.
Well, I mean, in a word, yes. I think down the line you will see that our policy will evolve in this way, and that there will be opportunities to reach deals with different countries or even groups of countries. I know this sounds controversial, I wouldn't even rule out that there may be a European deal at some point again. Not now, but in a few years, when people recognise this might be sensible for our economies and it makes sense in that way. So I think this script has yet to be written on this, but clearly there'll be an adjustment period right now where we get used to our new realities, and then 5-10 years, I think things will change quite dramatically.
I think it's worth saying, I mean, freedom of movement was not an issue when the EEC was first set up, because you had economies that were broadly the same, or as advanced or wealthy or whatever, and there wasn't huge flows. But when you get a situation where the minimum wage in, say, Romania is a quarter of that in Britain or in France or whatever, there is huge incentive for massive flows, big number flows. And I think that's what drove it. It became a sort of a major problem. It's worth saying that in trade deals, which is one of my, I worked on for 10 years on international trade deals, that Mode 4, for example, in trade deals allows for quite selective, effectively it's not really free movement, but it allows people to come and set up businesses or to sort of manage an office or, do certain things for a couple of years. And that is quite a sort of, that could be expanded in quite a disciplined way, if you know what I mean. It's not sort of open season, but that is happening with Australia and the UK, for example. I'm not sure what's happening in the EU, Australia at the moment, but there are aspects within trade deals that do allow an element of, I wouldn't call it free movement, but actually it allows services movement, really, but involves people, coming for certain periods of time, and mutual recognition of professionals is a big one. Architects, nurses, doctors. So you tend to kind of treat them differently, and there's a lot more freedom in that.
I would say that if Sweden was still an independent country like the UK are becoming again, I would have loved to have an agreement of free movement with Sweden and Great Britain.
Yeah.
Yeah, nicely said. Okay, I think we've run out of time. I don't know if there are any announcements, but thank you very much. Thank you, Alan, David, Mattias. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you all.